The gunshot echoed across the desolate Montana plains as Ronan Carter squinted through the rising dust, his weathered hand steady on the rifle that had just dispatched a rattlesnake threatening his livestock. The year was 1878, and for the past 3 years, Ronan had lived alone on his modest ranch, 20 miles from the nearest town of Aldridge, speaking more to his horses and cattle than to any human being. "Another day, another unwelcome visitor," he muttered, lowering his Winchester and surveying the rugged landscape that surrounded his 2-room cabin. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the property he'd built with his own hands after returning from the war with nothing but nightmares and a determination to never again depend on anyone. The 32-year-old cowboy's reputation in Aldridge was well established. He appeared only when necessary for supplies, spoke only when spoken to, and never, under any circumstances, accepted invitations for social gatherings. The townsfolk had long ago stopped trying to penetrate the invisible barrier he maintained between himself and the rest of humanity. Ronan returned to the woodpile, the physical labor providing the distraction he craved from the memories that haunted him. The rhythmic thud of the axe-splitting logs was his meditation, his prayer, his connection to a world that made sense. Here, on his isolated ranch, he controlled what came in and what stayed out. Here, there were no betrayals, no disappointments, no loss. As twilight descended, he carried an armful of wood to his cabin, pausing at the porch to watch the first stars appear in the vast Montana sky. A wolf howled in the distance, and Ronan felt a kinship with the solitary predator, both of them alone by choice and circumstance, both of them surviving. Inside his cabin, he lit the oil lamp and prepared a simple meal, moving with the efficiency of a man accustomed to doing everything for himself. The silence was complete, broken only by the occasional pop from the stove and the distant lowing of cattle. Ronan preferred it that way. Silence didn't ask questions. Silence didn't make promises it couldn't keep. The following morning brought with it a change in the air. Ronan sensed it even before he stepped outside the heaviness that preceded a storm. By midday, dark clouds had gathered on the horizon, and he worked quickly to secure his livestock and equipment. The first raindrops began to fall as he made his final check of the property, and by the time he reached his cabin, the skies had opened up with a vengeance. He stood on his porch, watching as sheets of rain transformed the dusty yard into mud within minutes. Lightning split the sky, followed almost immediately by thunder that shook the cabin's foundations. Ronan breathed deeply, savoring the scent of rain-soaked earth and the raw power of nature's display. The storm showed no signs of abating as daylight faded. Ronan lit his lamps and stoked the fire, settling into his well-worn chair with a book he'd read a dozen times. The comfort of familiar words was interrupted by an unfamiliar sound, a sound that didn't belong to the storm or to his usual evening routine. Someone was knocking on his door. For a moment, Ronan sat frozen, wondering if he'd imagined it. Nobody came to his door. Nobody had for years. The knocking came again, more insistent this time, accompanied by a voice barely audible above the storm. "Hello, is anyone there? Please, I need help," a woman's voice. Desperation evident in every syllable. Ronan's jaw tightened. He had no interest in playing savior to some lost traveler. Aldridge was a day's ride in good weather. Whoever was out there had made poor choices that weren't his responsibility. "Please," the voice came again, followed by more knocking. "The bridge washed out and my wagon overturned. I'm soaked through." Ronan closed his book and set it aside, irritation flaring. He moved to the door, intending only to direct the unwanted visitor toward the road to town, where they belonged. He unbolted the door and pulled it open just enough to see who had the audacity to disturb his solitude. The sight before him momentarily silenced any harsh words he'd prepared. A young woman stood on his porch, drenched to the bone, her dark hair plastered to her face, which was streaked with mud and what appeared to be blood from a cut above her eye. She clutched a sodden shawl around her shoulders, shivering violently in the cold rain. "Thank God," she breathed, relief washing over her features. "I didn't think anyone lived out here." "My town's 20 miles that way," Ronan interrupted, pointing east. "Follow the road." He began to close the door, but the woman's hand shot out, pressing against the rough wood. "Please," she said, her voice stronger now, determination replacing desperation. "It's pouring, it's nearly dark, and I'm injured. I'm not asking to move in, just shelter until morning. Unless you'd prefer to have my death on your conscience." Her directness caught him off guard. Most people in town had learned to simply accept his curtness and move on. This woman was clearly not from Whiteridge. Lightning flashed, illuminating her face more clearly. Despite the mud and the injury, he could see she was younger than he'd initially thought, perhaps mid-20s, with striking features and eyes that held no fear, only resolute determination. The reasonable part of him knew he couldn't send her back into the storm. The part of him that had survived by avoiding complications argued vehemently against letting anyone cross his threshold. Another crash of thunder decided for him. With a reluctant sigh, he pulled the door open wider. "One night," he growled. "You leave at first light." Relief flooded her face. "Thank you," she said, stepping inside, bringing with her the scent of rain and something floral he couldn't identify. "I'm Nora Aldridge," she offered, extending a hand that trembled slightly from cold. Ronan ignored the gesture. "There's a blanket on that chair. Fire's going. I'll get something for that cut." He moved to a cabinet where he kept basic medical supplies, acutely aware of the stranger now occupying his space. It had been so long since anyone other than himself had been inside these walls that her presence felt like an invasion, disrupting the careful order he'd established. When he turned back, she had removed her sodden shawl and draped the woolen blanket around her shoulders. The cut above her eye had started bleeding again, a thin rivulet of red trailing down her cheek. "Sit," he commanded, gesturing to a chair near the fire. To his surprise, she complied without argument, sinking onto the wooden seat with a barely suppressed groan. Now that she was in better light, he could see she was more injured than he'd initially thought. Bruises were forming on her exposed forearms, and she held herself carefully, as if her ribs pained her. "What happened?" he asked, wetting a clean cloth with alcohol. "Bridge over Carson Creek collapsed under my wagon," she explained, wincing as he pressed the cloth to her cut. "I managed to get the horse free, but the wagon went over, lost most of my belongings to the current. The horse, tied outside. I hope that's all right." Ronan grunted. He should have checked if she'd brought an animal. "I'll stable it after this storm lets up a bit." He worked in silence, cleaning the cut and determining it wouldn't need stitches. As he did, he found himself noticing details about her: the faint freckles across her nose, the determined set of her jaw, the way she endured his ministrations without complaint, despite what must have been considerable pain. "You have a name?" she asked finally, breaking the silence that had settled between them. "Ronan Carter." "Well, Mr. Carter, I appreciate your hospitality, reluctant though it may be." There was a hint of humor in her voice that caught him off guard. Most people responded to his brusqueness with either offense or fear. This woman seemed unfazed. "You're not from around here," he observed, packing away his supplies. "No," she agreed. "I'm from St. Louis originally. I was heading to Oregon to stay with my aunt." She paused, a shadow crossing her face. "There's nothing left for me back east." Ronan recognized the look in her eyes, the one that spoke of loss and the determination to outrun it. He'd seen it in his own reflection often enough. "There's stew," he said abruptly, moving toward the stove. "You should eat something." She accepted the bowl he offered with genuine gratitude, and they ate in silence, the storm continuing its assault outside. Ronan found himself stealing glances at his unexpected guest, noting how the firelight caught in her damp hair, turning it to burnished copper in places. "You live here alone?" she asked after finishing her meal. "Yes." "For how long?" "Long enough," she nodded, accepting his reticence. "It's a beautiful piece of land, what I could see of it before the storm hit." Ronan didn't respond. Beautiful wasn't a word he associated with his property. Functional, yes. Isolated, certainly. But beautiful. That implied seeing it with eyes that still looked for beauty in the world. "You should rest," he said finally, rising to clear their bowls. "You can take the bed, I'll sleep out here." "I couldn't possibly. It's not a debate," he cut her off. "You're injured and you'll heal better with proper rest." To his relief, she didn't argue further. He showed her to the small bedroom and provided a clean shirt she could use to sleep in, then retreated to give her privacy to change. As he arranged blankets on the floor near the fire, Ronan tried to ignore the unsettling awareness that his carefully constructed solitude had been breached. One night, he reminded himself, she would be gone in the morning and things would return to normal. Yet even as he thought it, he found himself listening to the soft sounds of movement from the bedroom, proof of another human presence in his home. It had been so long since he'd shared his space that he'd forgotten what it felt like, the particular tension of knowing you weren't alone. Sleep eluded him as the storm gradually subsided, leaving behind a gentle rainfall that tapped steadily on the roof. His thoughts kept returning to the woman sleeping in his bed, to her directness, her resilience, and the story she wasn't telling. Nobody traveled alone across such territory without good reason, especially not a woman. Not that it mattered. By tomorrow, she would be gone, and whatever secrets she carried would go with her. Morning arrived with clear skies and the earthy scent of the world washed clean. Ronan rose early, as was his habit, and stepped outside to assess any damage the storm might have caused. To his surprise, he found Nora already outside, tending to her horse, a sturdy chestnut mare that looked remarkably unscathed given the previous night's ordeal. "Good morning," she called, spotting him. "Hope you don't mind. Maple needed attention and I didn't want to wake you." Ronan noted that in daylight, the cut above her eye looked angry but clean, and though she moved with care, she seemed steadier than the night before. "How are you feeling?" he asked, approaching cautiously as if she were a wild animal that might bolt. "Like I wrestled with a creek and lost," she admitted with a rueful smile. "But I'll survive. Your hospitality made all the difference." Ronan shifted uncomfortably under her direct gaze. "I'll check the road after breakfast, see if it's passable." "About that," Nora said, her expression turning serious. "I need to be honest with you, Mr. Carter. My situation is complicated." Warning bells sounded in Ronan's mind. Complicated was exactly what he'd spent years avoiding. "My wagon is gone," she continued, "along with most of my possessions and all of my money. I have no means to pay for lodging in town, and the next stage to Oregon won't come through for 2 weeks. She took a deep breath, squaring her shoulders. "I'd like to propose a trade. I notice your place could use some attention, cooking, cleaning, mending. I'm skilled at all 3. In exchange for room and board until the next stage, I'll work from sunrise to sunset to earn my keep." Ronan stared at her, momentarily speechless. The logical response was clear, a firm no, followed by directions to town. The church there helped those in need. It wasn't his problem. And yet, as he looked at her standing there in the morning light, determination written across her face despite her circumstances. Something long dormant stirred within him. 2 weeks, he found himself saying. You work, you stay out of my way, and when the stage comes, you're on it. Relief and something like triumph flashed in her eyes. Agreed. You won't regret it, Mr. Carter. Ronan was already regretting it as they headed back to the cabin for breakfast. The first few days established a cautious routine. Nora proved to be as good as her word, rising early and working diligently throughout the day. She took over the cooking without comment, though Ronan noticed the distinct improvement in the meals. The cabin, which he had maintained in utilitarian cleanliness, began to feel different under her care. Small touches appeared, like wildflowers in a jar on the table, or the way she arranged his books more neatly on their shelf. For his part, Ronan maintained his distance, spending long hours with his livestock and on the repairs needed after the storm. They spoke little beyond what was necessary, sharing meals in what began as awkward silence but gradually evolved into a more comfortable quiet. On the fourth day, Ronan returned from checking fence lines to find Nora kneeling in what had once been a garden patch near the cabin. Years of neglect had left it overgrown and wild, but she had cleared a significant portion, revealing the rich soil beneath. "Hope you don't mind," she said, looking up as his shadow fell across her work. "I found some vegetable seeds in the storage shed. Thought I might get them started before I leave." Ronan frowned, memories surfacing of his mother tending that same patch of earth, her gentle hands coaxing life from the soil. After her death, he hadn't had the heart to maintain it. "It's your time to waste," he said gruffly, turning away before she could see the emotion her simple act had stirred. That evening, as they ate the stew she'd prepared, Nora broke their usual silence. "That photograph on your mantel," she said, nodding toward the faded image of a young couple. "Your parents," Ronan tensed. Nobody asked about his past. It was an unspoken rule in Whiteridge. The cowboy who lived outside town was left to his solitude and his secrets. "Yes," he answered shortly, expecting her to recognize his tone and drop the subject. Instead, she surprised him again. "They look happy. You have your father's eyes but your mother's expression. That slight curve at the corner of the mouth, like you're thinking something nobody else knows." Ronan glanced up sharply, unsettled by her observation. "They died when I was 19. Influenza took them both within a week of each other." The words emerged before he could stop them, facts he hadn't shared with anyone in years. "I'm sorry," Nora said simply. "Loss leaves marks on us all. And what marks has loss left on you, Miss Aldridge?" The question slipped out, born of curiosity he hadn't realized he still possessed. She studied him for a moment, as if deciding how much to reveal. "My father died in the war when I was 16. My mother remarried 2 years later a businessman named Edward Harrington. He seemed kind at first, but after my mother passed last winter." She trailed off, her fingers unconsciously touching a faint scar near her wrist. Understanding dawned on Ronan. "You're running from him." "I prefer to think of it as running toward something better," she corrected, a defiant lift to her chin. "My aunt in Oregon is my only remaining family. Edward made it clear he considered me his property after my mother died. I disagreed." The simple statement held volumes of unspoken pain, and Ronan felt a surge of anger toward a man he'd never met. "He won't find you here," he said, the protectiveness in his voice surprising them both. A small smile touched her lips. "No, I don't imagine many people find their way to your door, Mr. Carter. That seems to be by design." Ronan didn't deny it. "After the war, after my parents, I found people difficult out here. Things make sense. It's simple." "Simple isn't always better," Nora observed gently. "Just easier." Her words stayed with him long after they'd finished their meal and she'd retired to the bedroom. Simple isn't always better, just easier. The distinction hadn't occurred to him before, but he recognized the truth in it. The days began to develop a rhythm, and despite his initial resistance, Ronan found himself adjusting to Nora's presence. She respected his need for space, but didn't shrink from conversation when it arose naturally. She was direct in her speech, thoughtful in her observations, and possessed a quiet strength that commanded respect. 1 week into her stay, Ronan rode into Whiteridge for supplies. The town had changed little in the years. He'd lived near it, a single street of wooden buildings serving the needs of the surrounding ranches and farms. He tied his horse outside the general store and nodded curtly to the few people who acknowledged him. Inside, Mrs. Jenkins, the proprietor's wife, greeted him with her usual friendly efficiency. "Mr. Carter, right on schedule. The usual order, add coffee and sugar," he said, placing his list on the counter. "And," he hesitated, then added, "some fabric. Blue if you have it, Mrs." Jenkins raised her eyebrows but made no comment as she gathered his supplies. It was only when she was wrapping the length of cornflower blue cotton that she ventured. "Heard there was a wagon accident out by Carson Creek during that big storm. Road crew found the wreckage, but no driver." Ronan kept his expression neutral. "Is that so? Sheriff's been asking if anyone's seen a young woman, late 20s. Apparently her husband is mighty concerned about her well-being." "Her husband," Ronan repeated, a cold feeling settling in his stomach. "Wealthy fellow from back east. Arrived yesterday, offering a reward for information. Says his wife is unwell, prone to flights of fancy. Ran off after making wild accusations." Ronan paid for his purchases, his mind racing. "What's this husband look like? Tall, distinguished, dresses like money. Name's Harrington, I believe." Ronan thanked her and left quickly, securing his supplies to his horse with barely contained urgency. He needed to warn Nora. If Harrington had tracked her this far, she wasn't safe, not in Whiteridge and possibly not at his ranch either. The ride back seemed interminable. As he approached his property, he scanned the horizon for any sign of riders, relieved to see only the familiar landscape. He found Nora in the garden, her hands deep in the soil, humming softly to herself. She looked up as he dismounted, a smile starting to form until she saw his expression. "What's wrong?" "He's here," Ronan said without preamble. "Harrington, in Whiteridge, looking for you." The color drained from her face. "How? I was so careful." "Doesn't matter how. He's offering a reward, telling people you're unstable." Nora's hands curled into fists, soil crumbling between her fingers. "Of course he is. It's what he does, twists the truth until no one believes me." "Pack your things," Ronan said, already moving toward the stable. "We need to get you somewhere safer." "Where?" she asked, following him. "If he found me here, he'll find me anywhere nearby." Ronan paused, the reality of their situation sinking in. She was right. Small towns talked, and money had a way of loosening tongues. If Harrington was determined enough to track her to Montana territory, he wouldn't stop now. "Then we'll have to convince him you're not here to find," he said finally. "And make sure no one contradicts that story." As darkness fell, they finalized their plan. Nora would remain hidden at the ranch while Ronan returned to town the next day to gather information and, if possible, spread the word that he'd seen a woman matching Nora's description heading north toward the Canadian border. "You don't have to do this," Nora said as they sat by the fire that evening. "You've already done more than most would, taking in a stranger." Ronan looked at her across the flames, seeing not a stranger but a woman whose quiet courage and resilience had somehow breached the walls he'd built around himself. "I'm not doing it for a stranger," he said quietly. Something shifted in the air between them, an acknowledgement of the connection that had formed, unexpected and unwelcome as it might have been at the start. "Why did you really let me stay?" Nora asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "That first night you could have sent me away." Ronan considered the question, searching for honesty. "I told myself it was because of the storm, that I'm not the kind of man who'd send anyone out in that weather." He paused, meeting her gaze. "But I think part of me recognized something in you. A determination I used to have, before I decided it was easier to shut the world out. And now," she prompted, "now I'm not sure it was the right decision." The next morning, Ronan rode into Whitridge earlier than usual, wanting to gather information before too many people were about. The town was just coming to life. Shopkeepers opening their establishments, the smithy already at work, the clang of his hammer echoing down the street. Ronan tied his horse outside the sheriff's office and stepped inside, finding Sheriff Davis at his desk, a cup of coffee in hand. "Carter," the lawman acknowledged with surprise. "Twice in 2 days. Must be some kind of record." "Heard there was trouble," Ronan said, taking a seat across from the desk. "Thought I should check it out." Davis leaned back in his chair, studying him. "Since when do you concern yourself with town business? Since it might affect my livestock. Strangers poking around, looking for someone, tend to trespass." The sheriff nodded slowly. "You're talking about Harrington. He's staying at the hotel, offering good money for information about his wife. Says she's unstable, might be dangerous to herself." "You believe him?" Davis shrugged. "Not my place to judge a man's marriage troubles. But between you and me, something about him doesn't sit right. Too smooth by half." Ronan felt a surge of respect for the sheriff's instincts. "I saw a woman 3 days ago," he offered. "Riding north alone, didn't think much of it at the time." "North, you say?" Davis made a note. "I'll pass that along, though if she's heading for the border, he's got a long ride ahead of him." As Ronan stood to leave, the door opened, and a tall, impeccably dressed man entered. His expensive suit and polished boots marked him as an outsider, but it was the cold calculation in his eyes that confirmed Ronan's suspicions. This was Edward Harrington. "Sheriff, any news?" Harrington asked, then noticed Ronan. "Ah, a local resident. Perhaps you've seen my poor wife. Dark hair, green eyes, quite beautiful despite her condition." "Mr. Carter was just telling me he may have spotted her heading north," Davis interjected. "Several days ago now." Harrington's gaze sharpened as he assessed Ronan. "Is that so? And you're certain it was her?" "Matched the description," Ronan said flatly. "Didn't speak to her. She seemed in a hurry." "How fortunate I encountered you," Harrington said, his tone pleasant but his eyes cold. "I don't suppose you'd be willing to guide me. I'm not familiar with the territory, and I'm desperate to find my dear Nora before she comes to harm." "I run cattle," Ronan replied. "Can't leave them. Sheriff can point you to guides in town who'll take your money." He moved to leave, but Harrington stepped into his path. "You live outside town, I understand. Alone?" The question carried an undercurrent of suspicion that raised Ronan's hackles. "That's right. Perhaps I should visit your property, in case my wife sought shelter there." "Nothing to see but cattle and dust," Ronan said evenly. "And I don't welcome visitors." They stood in silent confrontation until Davis cleared his throat. "Mr. Harrington, I can arrange a proper guide for you if you're set on heading north. No need to bother Mr. Carter further." Harrington smiled, the expression not reaching his eyes. "Of course. Thank you for your information, Mr. Carter. I'm sure we'll meet again." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. As Ronan left the sheriff's office, he knew with certainty that Harrington didn't believe his story. Worse, the man seemed like the type to investigate personally. Ronan completed his errands quickly, purchasing additional ammunition and supplies that might be needed if they had to leave in a hurry. Throughout his time in town, he felt eyes on him, and not just Harrington's. The town was small enough that his unusual behavior 2 visits in as many days had been noted. By mid-afternoon, he was riding hard for home, anxiety building with each mile. His instincts told him Harrington wouldn't wait long to follow up on his suspicions, especially once he learned from the townspeople how unusual Ronan's recent behavior had been. He found Nora waiting anxiously on the porch, relief flooding her face as he dismounted. "You were gone so long I feared something had happened." "He was there," Ronan confirmed, leading her inside, "and he's suspicious. I don't think he believed my story about seeing you heading north." Nora sank into a chair, her expression grim. "He never believes anything that doesn't suit his purposes." "We need to be ready to leave," Ronan said, laying out the supplies he'd purchased. "He strikes me as the type to verify my story personally." "Leave," Nora echoed, "but this is your home. I can't ask you to abandon it because of me." Ronan looked around the cabin that had been his sanctuary and his prison for the past 3 years. "It's just a place," he said, surprising himself with the realization that he meant it. "And sometimes staying put is more dangerous than moving on." They spent the remainder of the day packing essential supplies, ensuring the horses were rested, planning a route that would take them west through terrain Ronan knew well from his hunting expeditions. As night fell, they sat together at the table, the lamp burning low. Neither had much appetite, the tension of waiting heavy in the air. "If he comes," Nora said suddenly, "I want you to let me face him. This is my fight, not yours." Ronan shook his head. "That's not how this works. I won't have you risking your life because of my problems." "It's too late for that," he said quietly. "The moment I let you in that door, your problems became mine." Nora reached across the table, her hand covering his. "Why? Why would you do all this for someone you barely know?" Ronan turned his hand to clasp hers, the contact sending warmth through him that had nothing to do with the fire crackling in the hearth. "Because in 1 week, you've shown me more life than I've lived in 3 years. Because you made me remember what it feels like to care about something beyond surviving another day." The confession hung between them, more honest than anything he'd said in years. Nora's eyes shimmered in the lamplight, and she rose from her chair, moving around the table to stand before him. "I came here running from a man who saw me as property," she said softly. "I never expected to find someone who would see me as a person worth fighting for." Ronan stood, the distance between them suddenly unbearable. His hand rose to cup her cheek, his thumb brushing away a tear that had escaped. "I spent 3 years shutting out the world," he murmured, "until you knocked on my door." The kiss, when it came, felt like coming home after a long, cold journey. Her lips were soft beneath his, tentative at first, then responding with a warmth that kindled something long dormant within him. His arms encircled her, drawing her closer, feeling the beat of her heart against his chest. When they finally parted, breathless and trembling, Ronan rested his forehead against hers. "Whatever comes tomorrow," he promised, "we face it together." The sound of approaching horses came shortly after dawn. Ronan, who had slept little, was already dressed and armed, peering through the window at the group of riders approaching his property. Harrington led them, accompanied by 2 men who, even at a distance, had the unmistakable look of hired guns. "He's here," Ronan said, turning to where Nora stood in the bedroom doorway, her face pale but resolute. "3 of them. Harrington and 2 gunmen." She nodded, straightening her shoulders. "As we planned, then." Their strategy was simple but risky. Nora would remain hidden in the root cellar beneath the cabin floor, accessible only through a trapdoor covered by a rug in the bedroom. Ronan would confront Harrington, deny having seen Nora and, if necessary, delay them long enough for her to escape through the cellar's external access point, concealed behind the woodpile. "Be careful," she whispered, touching his face. "He's more dangerous than he appears." Ronan captured her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm. "So am I. Now go." Once she was safely concealed, Ronan stepped onto the porch, rifle in hand, but pointed toward the ground, a warning, not a threat. He watched impassively as the three riders approached, noting the way Harrington's men spread out slightly, positioning themselves for advantage. "Mr. Carter," Harrington called, reining in his horse at a respectful distance. "I hope you'll forgive the early intrusion. I find myself unable to accept your account of my wife's whereabouts without verification." "Nothing to verify," Ronan replied. "Told you what I saw. A woman riding north alone. If it was your wife, she's long gone by now." Harrington smiled thinly. "And yet, certain discrepancies have come to my attention. The good people of Whiteridge mention you rarely visit town, yet you've been there twice in 2 days. Your purchases suggest preparation for a journey, and most intriguingly, several people noted you bought fabric. Blue fabric. My wife's favorite color." The calculation in Harrington's eyes confirmed what Nora had told him. This was a man accustomed to manipulating facts to suit his narrative, a man who wouldn't hesitate to use force to get what he wanted. "The fabric was for curtains," Ronan said evenly. "Sunlight's been bothering me." Harrington laughed, the sound devoid of humor. "Mr. Carter, let's dispense with the pretense. I know my wife is here. I know you've been harboring her. What I don't know is what tales she's told you to earn your protection." "Don't know what you're talking about," Ronan maintained, his grip tightening on his rifle as Harrington's men shifted in their saddles. "Perhaps you'd allow us to search your property, to put my concerns to rest." "No." The single word hung in the air between them. Harrington's pleasant expression hardened. "I had hoped we could resolve this amicably. It seems I was mistaken." He nodded to his men. "Search the place." The gunmen dismounted, hands hovering near their holstered weapons. Ronan raised his rifle, leveling it at the nearest man. "This is private property," he said, his voice steady. "You're not welcome here." "My wife is my property," Harrington countered, his mask of civility slipping. "And I will recover what belongs to me with or without your cooperation." "A woman isn't property," Ronan replied, anger simmering beneath his controlled exterior. "And if that's how you see her, it's no wonder she ran." Harrington's face flushed with rage. "So you admit she's here?" Before Ronan could respond, the crack of a gunshot split the morning air. For a disorienting moment, he thought one of Harrington's men had fired, but then he saw the shock on their faces, mirroring his own. "The next one won't miss," Nora's voice rang out from behind the cabin. She stood with a shotgun braced against her shoulder, eyes fierce with determination. "Tell your men to drop their weapons, Edward." Harrington recovered quickly, his surprise morphing into a calculated smile. "Nora, darling, how clever of you to elude me for so long, but this little adventure has gone far enough, don't you think? It's time to come home." "I am home," she replied, not lowering the shotgun. "And you're trespassing." The tension crackled between them, a standoff with no clear resolution. Ronan kept his rifle trained on Harrington's men, acutely aware that any sudden movement could trigger violence. "You always were stubborn," Harrington said finally. "But do you really think this cowboy will protect you once he learns the truth about what you did in St. Louis?" Nora's expression flickered momentarily, and Harrington pressed his advantage. "Did you tell him how you attacked me with a kitchen knife? How you had to be restrained by the servants? The doctors all agreed you're not well, Nora." "I told him everything," she countered, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "How you beat me, how you locked me in my room for days, how you threatened to have me committed if I ever tried to leave." Harrington's pleasant facade crumbled completely. "You ungrateful," he cut himself off, visibly regaining control. "Mr. Carter, surely you can see she's delusional. These accusations are symptoms of her condition." "I see a woman standing her ground," Ronan replied, "and a man who tracked her across half the country to drag her back. That tells me all I need to know." One of Harrington's men shifted, hand dropping to his holster. Ronan fired a warning shot into the ground near his feet. "Next one's not a warning." "You're outnumbered," Harrington snarled, his composure gone, "and you're harboring my wife illegally. The law is on my side." "Is it?" The new voice came from beyond the property line, where Sheriff Davis sat astride his horse, revolver drawn. "Because from where I'm sitting, I see armed men threatening a Montana resident on his own land. That's not how we do things in my jurisdiction." Relief washed over Ronan. The sheriff must have followed Harrington, suspicious of his intentions. "Sheriff," Harrington began, attempting to reclaim his authoritative tone. "This woman is my wife, and she is standing on private property with a shotgun telling you to leave," Davis interrupted. "In Montana territory, that's her right. As for your claims of marriage, I've received a telegraph this morning that contradicts them quite firmly." He withdrew a paper from his vest pocket. "According to the St. Louis authorities, you're wanted for questioning regarding the suspicious death of Nora's mother and subsequent misappropriation of her estate. They were most interested to learn of your whereabouts." The color drained from Harrington's face. "That's preposterous." "A misunderstanding, one you can clear up with them directly," Davis said firmly. "Now, you and your men will disarm and accompany me back to Whiteridge. The next stage east leaves tomorrow morning. You'll be on it." For a moment, it seemed Harrington might resist, but the fight left him as quickly as it had flared. With the sheriff's revolver trained on them, his men reluctantly surrendered their weapons. "This isn't over," Harrington hissed, glaring at Nora as the sheriff's deputy who had accompanied Davis secured his wrists. "You'll never be free of me." "She already is," Ronan said, moving to stand beside Nora, his hand finding hers. "And if you ever come near her again, it'll be the last mistake you make." They watched in silence as the sheriff led Harrington and his men away, the dust from their horses' hooves settling in the morning sunlight. Only when they had disappeared from view did Nora lower the shotgun, her hands shaking with delayed reaction. "You came out of hiding," Ronan said, turning to her. "That wasn't the plan." "I couldn't let you face them alone," she replied simply. "Not when I knew what Edward was capable of." He brushed a strand of hair from her face, marveling at the courage of this woman who had appeared on his doorstep in a storm and somehow managed to break through the walls he'd built around his heart. "How did the sheriff know to come?" she asked, leaning into his touch. "I didn't trust Harrington to give up easily," Ronan admitted. "After I left town yesterday, I rode to the sheriff's office and told Davis everything. About you, about Harrington's threats. Asked him to check your story with the authorities in St. Louis." Nora's eyes widened. "You believed me enough to involve the law." "I believed in you," he corrected softly. "There's a difference." She rose on tiptoe to press her lips to his, a kiss filled with gratitude and something deeper, something that felt remarkably like a future neither of them had dared to imagine. "What happens now?" she asked when they finally parted. "The stage to Oregon leaves tomorrow." Ronan looked at the woman who had knocked on his door during a storm and refused to be turned away, who had brought light and warmth back into a life he'd resigned to shadows. "That depends," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "on whether you still want to go to Oregon or if you might consider staying here. With me." Her answer was in the joy that bloomed across her face, in the tears that spilled onto her cheeks, in the way she threw her arms around his neck, and held on as if she'd found something precious she never intended to lose. "I think," she whispered against his lips, "that I've finally found where I belong." In the years that followed, the ranch flourished under their combined care. The garden Nora had started that first week grew to provide vegetables for their table and the town market. The cabin expanded to accommodate their growing family, first a son with Ronan's serious eyes and Nora's determined spirit, then twin daughters who brought laughter back to spaces that had known only silence for too long. Ronan Carter, who had once shut his door to the world, learned to open it again, not to everyone, but to those who mattered. And Nora, who had knocked until he let her in, found in his love the safety and belonging she had sought across a continent. Together, they built a life neither had dared to dream possible. One day, one season, 1 year at a time, beneath the vast Montana sky that had witnessed their beginning and would watch over their forever.